My name is Nicole Granan. I'm a public archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Northwest region, and my office is here in Pensacola, Florida, right down on Main Street. And this is our Zoom into Archaeology program, which is a relatively new program that we started just last year for reasons that I'm sure you understand at this point. But it's been so popular that we've continued to do it, even though we've started to resume our in-person programming. So I'm so excited to see you all join us on this Thursday afternoon. It's excellent to see everybody. Just a couple of things before we go ahead and get started and before I introduce our speaker. We do have a lot of really cool functions in Zoom. I've gone ahead and muted everybody so that it cuts down on the distraction a little bit for other people watching the presentation. We're also recording this presentation for folks who aren't able to join us at 3:30 Central Time on a Thursday. And we'll put that up on our YouTube channel early next week so that they can stream it anytime they want. But if you would just go ahead and leave your cameras turned off, that again will cut down on the distraction when we do have the recording up online. We have some great chat features here in Zoom, so we can go ahead and use that chat function. If you have questions for the speaker or if you have any comments that you want to make, please feel free to use that. You're also welcome to unmute and ask those questions yourself at the end of the presentation, but we will go through all of the questions in the chat at the end as well, in the order that they're asked. So that way, if you have a burning question on your mind and you think you'll forget it, like I always do, before the end of the presentation, you can go ahead and get it down really fast. So that goes over our kind of Zoom etiquette. I've gone ahead and started recording the presentation. So I want to go ahead now and introduce our speaker, who's Barbara Clark. She's the director for the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Northwest and North Central regions. And I'm so thrilled to have her here with us today. She's got a great presentation in store for us. I'm actually going to go ahead and just throw it over to Barbara. Thanks, Barbara.
All right. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Like Nicole said, if you have any burning questions, throw them in the chat and I will get to them as best I can. I know we've been doing these Zoom lectures for a year, but it's still kind of weird. We're so used to being able to read our audience and stuff. So it's a little different, but I will try my best. All right. So I don't know how many of you are actually familiar with the Turpentine industry, but it was a huge industry here in the northern parts of Florida and all of the southeast and up the eastern seaboard. So it has its roots in the 17th century, and as the colonies grew, so did the turpentine industry. It's called the naval store industry because one of the main and earliest uses for this turpentine product was the pitch, which is kind of the raw product from the trees. It was used to caulk wooden ships. So it was a really important industry in the colonies. It was eventually used for other purposes as well. And about in the 1850s, you start to see it used in everything from cleaning products to medicines to industrial products. But it didn't really make its way down into Florida until about the 1870s. And I'll go over this more in a little bit, but the way the trees were originally processed actually was harmful to the trees, and eventually they would die. And so the industry was forced to kind of move south as the trees died and were no longer able to produce pitch. Now, the native environment for the type of tree they use, which is usually a longleaf pine, is all along the eastern seaboard in the southeast, through the Gulf Coast of Florida out into Texas. And so that was kind of where you see the naval store industry pop up. And throughout this presentation, you will be exposed to one of my favorite authors and cultural anthropologists, Zora Neale Hurston. In 1939, she visited several turpentine camps, including one in Taylor County and Dixie County. And this was as part of the Federal Writers Project, which was a program of the CCC Conservation, Civilian Conservation Corps. She was a trained anthropologist as well as a writer. She's written several books. I highly recommend her. But throughout this presentation, throughout creating this presentation, I relied heavily on her and her ethnographic research that she did while visiting these turpentine camps. And there's still a lot of these essays are still considered to be authoritative today by researchers. And you can find them online if you're interested. Just Google Zora, Neale, Hurston, Turpentine Camps, and they'll pop up. So if you've ever been in any old growth forests in North Florida, there's a high likelihood that you have encountered what are called cat faces. And these are scars on the trees that are made during the turpentine collection process. If you're lucky, you might also find some of the gutters, which are the metal pieces that kind of directed the turpentine or the gum into the turpentine cups to collect it. Now, this is where I do mention, I know these are highly sought after by collectors. If you are on state or federal property or anybody else's property other than your own and you don't have permission to collect these items, please leave them in place. These are considered artifacts, and so they are protected by state and federal law on state and federal lands. So collecting the raw product, the gum, they used several very specialized tools that would scar the tree into those cat face shapes. And this would cause the gum to run. And there were two terms that essentially mean the same thing, and a lot of people get confused. Chipping and pulling are the same act, creating the scars on the trees. Chipping usually refers to about chest level down, and pulling is when you're doing it higher up. Your tool is on an extended pole like you see there in the lower right-hand corner. And these folks were paid by the barrel. And they also, early on, they would cut boxes into the base of the tree. They didn't have the cups like you and I are probably used to seeing in photographs. They would actually cut a little box, and the gum would run down into that. And that was not very effective because it did eventually kill the tree. And it also made it useless as far as lumbering goes after the turpentining was complete. Now, I always like to show artifacts because after all, we are archaeologists. The axe head you see there is a box axe. This is what would have been used to cut those boxes in the trees. And then you also have what's left of a cat face with the metal gutters. And you can even see the little nail there that would have hung the turpentine cup. So these have been found on state property. They're being stored at the State Artifacts Collection with the Division of Historical Resources. If you're local here in Tallahassee, that facility is actually located at Mission San Luis. So I don't know if we have any Georgia Bulldog fans here, but there is a Georgia Bulldog connection to turpentining. Charles Hardy, he was the inventor of the Hardy Cup, which is what we are all really familiar with when we think of turpentine. This is the one everybody wants to collect. It kind of looks like a terracotta flower pot. He invented this. He was a chemist and a professor at the University of Georgia. He was also the founder of the University of Georgia football program. So he attended a lecture by a French chemist, an agricultural chemist, who was concerned about the sustainability of the turpentining industry. And in France, what they had done was created a cup system so they wouldn't have to cut boxes in the base of the trees any longer. Hardy did his own research and came to a similar conclusion. And so he developed the Hardy Cup, which is what you all are probably very familiar with. He first started out with the clay cups, but then he also developed later on metal cups, which were a little bit more practical when you're out in the woods. Clay, after all, does break. So you'll find variations of this, but the traditional that you see up there in the left corner, and that's what everybody wants to collect. But again, please be aware of where you are collecting. So the turpentining process, of course, involved distillation. And the distillery was usually located in a centralized area, and you would have either like trains, or usually these trains were mule cart type situations that would take the barrels of raw product and bring them to the turpentine still. So this was a very, very dangerous job. And uh, there was no OSHA. So the people that worked in these stills often were injured. They were paid very minimally. Fire was a huge hazard. Turpentine is very, very volatile. And it's really interesting to me because you collect a 50 gallon barrel of raw gum, and it would only yield about 11 gallons of turpentine after distilled, and about 330 pounds of rosin. Rosin is what is used to caulk ships and waterproof wood and rigging and things like that. So there were various jobs at the turpentine camps, not just the folks that were out in the trees collecting them, but there's also the distillery workers, as well as a lot of these places actually had coopers on hand that would work there. And most of the folks were men, although there is documented evidence that we have women that were working out here as well. So remember I said that in the 1850s, start seeing a bunch of different other uses for turpentine. And some of them are quite interesting. My favorite one, of course, is Vicks VapoRub. It no longer contains turpentine, thankfully. Turpentine has been shown to have detrimental health effects and is now regulated quite heavily. But you had everything from paint thinners, wood polish, cleansers, and different types of salves and medical products as well. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Turpentine Camps. This type of work was very remote, and so the workers usually lived in camps that were close to the work sites. These were considered very temporary. The housing was usually poorly constructed. In some cases, and this also is true with lumbering, they would actually take the houses and either take them apart or put them on top of rail cars and move them to the next location. So you can imagine they weren't very well constructed. But usually folks, their whole family lived in these houses. Women would do things like take in laundry. There would be people that would have schooling there, or the children would go to a school nearby. So it was essentially a community. And here's just a few photographs. I always like to throw in photographs from the Florida Memory Project. This is a product of the Florida Archives. If you're ever looking for really cool old photos, that's the place to go. So I highly recommend just kind of perusing that in your spare time or during your research. But as you can see, there's a variety of folks. There's young, there's old, there's women, there's men, there's African American, there's colored, there's white folks. So you have a very good mix. Now, later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the convict leasing system, which is a completely different situation than this. So I just wanted to point that out so everybody keeps that in mind. Again, here's some artifacts that have been found at Turpentine Camps. Now, I like to show these because one strength of archaeology is getting at the entire picture of who was living there and what they were doing. Usually when we research Turpentine Camps, the documentation is going to be heavily about the turpentine workers, right? Or the companies that own the land. But when you're digging in the soil and you're finding artifacts, you'll find marbles from the children that live there, gaming pieces, dolls, medicine bottles, things like that, that kind of give you a more holistic picture of what was going on at these sites. So this is interesting to me because there was a severe pay discrepancy between female and male workers. Like I said, it was male dominated, but there were female workers. You'll see that a male made about $10 to $12. This was per month. Adult females would make about 2. A woods rider, which let me explain what that is. A woods rider was essentially the foreman. He was the boss of a group of folks that were working a specific tract of trees. Now, most companies paid in company script. So they weren't actually getting real money. They were only getting money that was good for use at the company commissary or the company store. So that's an important thing to remember as well. Now, this here shows a typical diet of what they would have eaten in these turpentine camps. And it's important to note that you're remote, you're being paid in company script, so you're only really able to buy from the company's store. The companies would buy their groceries wholesale and then sell to their workers at a retail price. And you could not leave your employment until you had paid your debt to the company store. And in some cases, people would run off and the company would get law enforcement after them and things like that. There's a lot of documentation that shows that happened quite frequently. So these were, like I said, very remote places. There was no law enforcement out there. The law very rarely visited. When I was going through the Florida archives, I found a few documented cases where law enforcement arrived after a murder, and it was ruled self-defense, and law enforcement left with, from what I could tell based on my research, nobody was charged with any crimes. So there was gambling, there was, all sorts of kind of maybe shady things going on in these camps. And speaking of some crazy things that happened, you have to remember again, it was remote. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a gentleman named Railroad Bill. Some of you may have heard some songs. He was a popular stage name for several blues singers throughout the early 1900s, late 1800s. He was an escaped convict lease worker. So he was an escaped convict worker. And I'll talk a little bit about the convict leasing system in just a second. But he was kind of the, I guess you could say, the Robin Hood of the turpentine workers. He escaped his mandatory work at a turpentine camp, and he was robbing railroad or rail trains on the L&N Railroad that was in the Escambia County area. And detectives claimed that it was this gentleman, Morris Slater, but nobody knows for sure. But a bounty was put on his head, dead or alive. And unfortunately, in the time of Jim Crow, many other African-American men who were said to resemble Morris Slater were either injured or killed during this great manhunt for Railroad Bill. He was eventually caught and he was killed in a shootout with sheriffs and a store owner, I believe. And his body was placed on display, but he was buried in an unmarked grave in St. John's Cemetery, and nobody knew where it was until some documents from the cemetery, burial documents, were found in 2012. And so as you can see, this looks like a modern headstone. It is. It was placed there in 2012 after those documents became available. So he's one of the characters in the Panhandle that we can actually put a name to. Of course, he was a little bit more notorious than most turpentine workers. So like I said, he was part of the Convict Leasing Program. The Convict Leasing Program was essentially a way for heavily agricultural programs that relied a lot on manual labor to keep the cost down by leasing convicts, because they didn't have slaves during Reconstruction. And Reconstruction lasted about 1865 to 1876. But the convict leasing program in Florida, at least, lasted into the 1920s. And this, in some ways, you can argue was worse than slavery. And I don't mean that lightly, obviously, but these convicts were not seen as property. They were completely disposable. If they were injured or they were killed, they could be replaced free of cost. So it was quite a horrible system. And even early on throughout the country, Florida was known as having probably one of the most notorious convict leasing programs. Of course, there were other states that had them, but there's articles in Harper's Weekly and the New York Evening Post uh, essentially calling out Florida's convict leasing program as deplorable and inhumane. Convict leasing was really, really profitable for both the state and brokers, which were private contractors that brokered between the state justice departments and the private corporations. And it's really important to note that even during much of the products that were used during World War I were actually from private companies that used convict labor. So this I found really interesting. I came in the Florida archives, which if you're ever doing research, highly recommend you check them out. But this is about doctor's visits for convicts at convict leased camps. They had a doctor that would come out weekly as part of the contract for leasing convicts. And it wasn't necessarily to see how healthy and how well cared for the convicts were. It was to judge how much work you could expect them to do, because that in turn told the broker how much the company should be paying for their convicts. And as you can see here at the bottom, Mr. Fred Jones died of consumption, and he gets a 0-0, meaning he's not doing any work. But then you have Caesar Givens at the top, who had rheumatism and kidney trouble, and he could do about a quarter of the work of a healthy grown man. Another issue they had was these folks were living in camped in long kind of dormitory style housing. A lot of times the doors were locked. They were very poorly ventilated. There were sometimes documents of fires that killed several people because they couldn't escape because the doors were locked. But one of the other problems they had was smallpox in these overcrowded camps. And I find this interesting just because of what we've been going through with the pandemic. But even during a smallpox outbreak, they wanted to vaccinate everybody in phases, so they had enough workers to continue working the trees. So I just thought that was really interesting, considering, you know, the pandemic we're having right now. And this just says, we are taking immediate measures to have all the unvaccinated men inoculated at once in lots of, say, 6 at a time, in order to allow daily work to proceed without too much interference. So just like the COVID vaccine, I guess the smallpox vaccine leaves you incapacitated afterwards. So the convict leasing program came under serious scrutiny by, like I said, people all across the country. And here you can see an excerpt from the New York Evening Post. These folks essentially were still enslaved. There's no other way to really put it. But it did come to an end. Martin Talbert was a young man. I believe he was 25, and he was arrested for hopping a freight train in Leon County here in Tallahassee. And he was ordered to pay $25 or spend 3 months hard labor. His family in Idaho got word of this, and they actually sent $50, $25 to pay the fee, and then $25 so that he could buy a ticket home. There was, through mishandling of the money, the Justice Department never received it, and he was sent to Putnam Lumber Company. So not a turpentine camp, but a lumber company. There were various industries in Florida that used convict labor. And he was injured there, and he was whipped over 50 times because he wasn't able to work. Turns out that he was ill as well as injured. And his family caught wind of this and, of course, contacted the media. Now, Martin Talbert did end up dying from his injuries that evening. And the gentleman, the whipping boss, as he was called, his last name was Higginbotham, was arrested, and he was put on trial, and he was let go. So he was never essentially punished for what he did, which just kind of fueled the media even more and the outrage even more. And so by 1923, just a few years later, as this was still going on, Governor Hardy signed a bill which outlawed the convict leasing system in Florida. And it's interesting too, because this reached even parts of Europe. So it was big news at the time. So the turpentine industry did eventually decline. I found documents of there being some turpentine work up until the 1980s, but it was very sparse here in Florida. The industry declined for a variety of reasons. First of all, we were no longer using wooden ships. So all that rosin that they were using to caulk those ships was no longer necessary. There also wasn't very much investment in research into the industry and how else that product could be used. There was actually a research station in Olesti which graded turpentine and kind of researched what else it could be used for. And the state just didn't really put a lot of money into that. You also had competing industry. Tall oil, which is a byproduct of pulping, was less expensive, less labor intensive, and could be used for similar things. And you also had stockpiles that had been kept in place since the 1930s during the CCC era. And nobody ever knew when they were going to be released. So it kind of forced price insecurity. And there was also a very severe shortage of workers. I found several documents that stated you could actually make more on unemployment than you could working in the turpentine industry. So, there was really no incentive there. So eventually the turpentine industry did decline. It's really no longer active anymore. There's an agricultural museum in Tifton, Georgia, and then also the University of Florida. They both have turpentine stills, and they do occasionally do runs of turpentine just for educational purposes to show how the product was distilled. But even that is very sparse. It's a very labor intensive and dangerous thing. So most of the time it's just you go, you look, you see what the turpentine still looked like, and it's a stagnant exhibit. Essentially, it's not like they're working the distillery anymore. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. And are there any questions or comments? No? All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. And like Nicole said, she had to leave us early today. But like Nicole said, this will be on our YouTube channel. It should be up by next week. So please visit us there. Oh, I see a comment. Oh, well, thank you. Yes. And there are a bunch of resources for turpentining. I get a lot of comments from people wanting to know about specific turpentine camps or specific family members that may have worked there. I don't do that type of research, but for those of you that are interested in it, this is a good place to look is the Florida Archives. And as far as I know, there's no map that would show the distribution of the industry across Florida. A good resource for that might be the Florida Archives. I'm not sure on that. And as far as a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, if you want an actual copy of the PowerPoint presentation, you can contact myself and I will put my email in the chat and I can send you a copy. Okay. So please contact myself. And like I said, it will also be up on YouTube as well. And if anybody has any questions or comments that come up later, please feel free to email me. We also got a question about, in reference to the wages, what period of time are those are for those periods of time. So $3 in 1930s. Yeah, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. I hope that answered your questions. Oh, it's per month. So not a lot of money. But if anybody has any other questions, I'll stick around for a few minutes. Otherwise, you all are free to go. And I thank you so much for joining us. All right, looks like there's no more questions. So I'm going to let you all go. Y'all have a wonderful day.